Hi philosophers, this video is on Martin Luther King and civil disobedience, which is also one of your options for the discussion for this section of sociopolitical philosophy. And there's also a digging deeper option, extra credit reflection that you can do. So again, if you're either good with your grade and you want to do something a little bit different than quiz and homework, I would check that out under week 8, digging deeper. So there's a video from BBC that kind of goes through civil disobedience. And there's also one in the sanctuary movement. So there's multiple kinds of civil disobedience cases that you can talk about. We typically think about the civil rights movement. We often forget about the independence movement in India and Gandhi, which actually was very inspiring to King. That's where he got a lot of his ideas, as well as from Locke and this idea of natural rights, and then even going all the way back to Augustine and Aquinas and this idea of natural law, right? So King, this idea of civil disobedience is deeply rooted in sociopolitical philosophy, right? And the arguments there about government, about laws, about the relationship between our rights and our government, and when, right, it is not only okay, but actually required of us, right, to break unjust laws in order to bring about better respect for law, right, and for our natural rights. So if you watch the other video on natural rights, King is firmly in the Locke camp of natural rights. So I'm going to go through that really quickly and then read a couple excerpts from the letter from Birmingham jail, which you can also find under the discussion thread. There's a link to that, and if you're a real history buff, a link to the original typed letter that he sent out as well. So I think this one is also in the textbook, but this idea of human law, right, being sort of the most basic, right, and that which needs to be held accountable by higher forms of law. So the two we're thinking about here is human law and then natural law, right? So human law, that which is made by humans. Again, we're finite beings, so going all the way back to metaphysics, right? We're finite, we make mistakes, and so our human law needs to always be checked by natural law, right? And that is given by ultimately the divine. Okay, so there's that link again in King to his metaphysical beliefs in a divine. That there is some kind of divine order, right, which gives us a natural law, also gives us our natural rights, right? And then our human law is subject to that. Okay, human law cannot override, should not override natural law and natural rights of human beings. Okay, so there's 3 main requirements for something to be considered civil disobedience as opposed to just a protest or opposed to just disobedience, right, breaking the law. So first, it needs to aim to bring about attention to unjust laws. So it needs to identify something as unjust, that the human law, right, does not correspond with natural law. That it needs to be done openly and non-violently. So that's really crucial, right? I can't just not pay my taxes and say I'm engaging in civil disobedience and not tell anybody. It has to be done openly where people can see, because it needs to, again, draw attention to the unjust law. The aim is to change that law. And it needs to be done non-violently. So that's a particular, he calls it also lovingly, but that's a particular piece that he gets from Gandhi, right? From that move for Indian independence from Britain. And so that, I think, is crucial when we're talking about Black Lives Matter movement now, and a lot of the sort of controversy around whether or not this is a peaceful movement or not. I think going back to the question about nonviolence as opposed to being peaceful, right? Because sometimes your actual body, right, showing up to a place is disruptive, right, to the status quo, right? Calling attention to injustice is oftentimes in and of itself not a peaceful process. It can be a nonviolent process, however. Okay, so I think that's an important distinction to think about in terms of the conversations we're having right now around protests. And then finally, the willingness to accept the consequences. So the folks in the civil rights movement and Gandhi and so on, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, were all willing to go to jail, accept the consequences. That does not mean, right, that they should have had dogs, right, sicked on them. It does not mean they should have had water hoses, right, really hurting their bodies in really intense ways. It does not mean that people should necessarily have um, rubber bullets, right, that can do real damage, or tear gas. But being willing to, right, go to jail or accept whatever consequences the current system, right, doles out, actually then in this approach to civil disobedience draws attention to the system that is unjust. So you have to be able to, again, be willing to accept those consequences. So I want to now kind of shift over to his letter from Birmingham jail and a little bit of context for that in case you want to read it and write about it, or even use it in a paper if you're arguing for or against civil disobedience. And thinking about as well, right, connections to current protests. So remember that during the civil rights movement, a lot of times any protest, right, any showing up of Black bodies to certain spaces was in and of itself illegal because of the way the laws were written, because local authorities often would not give permits to march or to be present, because being at a lunch table, right, a whites only lunch table or space, was breaking the law, or going to the front of the bus was breaking the law. Right, those kinds of things. Now, right, protest has in some ways been tamed, right? We have marches every year, MLK marches, and all of the proper forms are filled out. So just showing up to a protest is not in and of itself civil disobedience. It's when you are breaking, right, some law, whether it's where you're supposed to be, right, or what you're doing, right, that's drawing attention. So again, if you look at the video on the sanctuary movement, you have houses of worship who are engaging in civil disobedience and giving sanctuary to those without documentation in the United States. That would be another example. You have cases of indigenous groups protecting their land from oil pipelines, right? And so being willing to be arrested and having government officials, right, come up to you and tell you you're breaking the law by being there would be another example. So thinking about, you have to be breaking, right, some law in order to draw attention to an unjust law. So that's sort of the key component. So we certainly had, I think, cases of that within the larger movement, Black Lives Matter protests and other kinds of protests, but not any protest is going to be civil disobedience in and of itself. So the letter from Birmingham jail was written in April of 1963, so it was right around Easter as well. And a little bit of context that I think is important for what we're seeing now is that when King, right, who's from Atlanta at the time, comes into Birmingham, he is seen as an outside agitator, right? And not just by the white community, but by Black clergy. So the letter is actually to, right, fellow Black leaders, fellow Black clergy who said, please don't come in here and make a ruckus, right? And cause problems, right? And cause discord within our community, that you need to stay right in Atlanta and do what you're doing there. So he's seen as an instigator, as an extremist, as an outsider, and as pushing too far too fast. Okay. So he's asked to be patient. He's asked to wait for these changes to the law. And we see a lot of that right now happening as well, that people are being called instigators, right, that they're not peaceable, all of those kinds of things. So that's just something to look out for, right, those parallels. We often see King as this peaceful figure, as this, figure that everybody can get behind, regardless of your political stance. And yet at the time, he was very much seen as a troublemaker, right? So not unlike Socrates, going all the way back to Athens. So I'm going to read just a couple little excerpts so that you can make some of these connections with what I've already said about civil disobedience. So he comes in and he says, we had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community. Right? Now, one of the things he says, when we did our workshops, we prepared to come in here, right? We didn't just come in, right, without a plan, right, without a real aim, okay? It was, are you willing to accept blows without retaliation? And that's huge. That's a lot to ask for anybody. Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? Okay? And so there's a lot of power when he's writing this letter from jail to say, I've accepted these consequences, but ultimately it was because we had no other option, right? People were not listening. So really going to that final requirement. He goes on to say, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code, okay, that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. So you can also read that as the natural law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is rooted in eternal law and natural law. And eternal law usually kind of goes up here as well. So you don't have to parse that out in any of your particular essays. You would kind of just stick to these two here, and you can just talk about natural law. But there's various levels of law that those in theology we'll talk about. Any law that uplifts human personality is just, and any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. Look what he just did there. He did a deductive argument, right, in this letter, in this public letter, right? He name drops, right, philosophers in order to make, right, this argument beyond any kind of philosophy classroom. So I'm going to go over that deductive argument one more time so you can see it in action. Law is unjust if it degrades human personality, right? Goes against that natural right. Segregation damages human personality. Therefore, segregation is unjust. Okay? So the part where the segregationists are disagreeing is that second premise. King is saying segregation damages the human personality, and the segregationists disagreed, right? And so it leads to different conclusions. So I'll type this up as well in the announcement that goes along with it, but I want you to think about he's using a deductive argument, which is something that's kind of eludes a lot of folks in this class until the very end of the semester. You start to kind of get it. They're very, in some ways, overly simplified, right? Laying the most simple parts of your argument out on the table and making them connect, okay? Finally, he says, I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. So a lot of times what you hear people saying against civil disobedience of any kind is that you need to have respect for the law and the process of the law. And what King is saying is, actually, I have the most respect for the law, and that's why we need to call out and get rid of any laws that are unjust, okay? And I'm going to read this very last part, and I want you to listen to it with Black Lives Matter in mind, right? You might disagree, you might agree with that movement, and you might have mixed feelings about it. But I want you to see if you hear some of the rhetoric, some of what's going on now in what King is saying, right, back in the 1960s, okay? So he says, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro, right, his great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with your goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises us to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute understanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. So you can read the whole thing. This is just a small excerpt. It's a really long letter, right? Again, it's rife with all kinds of philosophical name dropping, which he integrates so well. And it's something, if you want to start thinking about doing the presentation version for this class as opposed to the essay for your final, this is a really good example of what I'm talking about when I say public philosophy. Okay, so I hope I see some of you on the discussion board talking about civil disobedience, what that means to you, and then maybe even doing that digging deeper extra credit letter as well. All right.